the vehicle and hand me your license.
I am complying, but you have no right to treat me this way. I am a captain.
Officer Brian Hutchinson had been with the Richmond Police Department for 19 years. And in those 19 years, he'd compiled a record that should have raised immediate concerns. 23 complaints, 17 of them involving African American citizens. A black surgeon in Windsor Farms, accused of stealing the Mercedes she'd just purchased. An African American attorney in the Fan District, questioned about whether he really lived in the townhouse he owned. A black professor at VCU, detained for suspicious behavior while jogging in his own neighborhood. Each one involved an African American professional in a predominantly white area. Each one followed the same script. Officer Hutchinson couldn't believe black people belonged, owned, had earned their place. Each complaint ended identically. Implicit bias training that Hutchinson attended but never applied. Cultural sensitivity workshops that never changed anything. One Tuesday morning in Richmond, Virginia, his 19 years of seeing criminality in black skin collided with someone Hutchinson never expected. An African American woman with wings on her uniform. Someone who commanded a 737, who knew federal aviation law better than most attorneys, and who knew exactly what Hutchinson was doing. And that collision would finally end Hutchinson's career, cost the city $1.8 million, and expose a department that had tolerated his pattern of racial profiling for nearly 2 decades. An African American woman in her late 30s, Captain Simone Ashford, was driving her Audi A6 through Richmond's Museum District at 5:15 a.m. on a clear Tuesday morning in September. Captain Ashford wasn't just anyone. She'd been flying commercial aircraft for Delta Airlines for 14 years, the last 6 as captain, 7,000 flight hours, routes to Europe, South America, across the country, millions of passengers transported safely. She'd graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, completed military flight training with the Air National Guard, and earned her airline transport pilot certificate, the highest level of aircraft pilot certification. She was one of fewer than 150 black female airline captains in the entire United States. That Tuesday morning, Simone had just left her home in the Museum District, heading to Richmond International Airport for a 7:30 a.m. departure to Atlanta. She was in full uniform, the navy blue jacket with 4 captain stripes on each sleeve, crisp white shirt, black slacks, perfectly polished shoes. Her flight bag sat on the passenger seat. Her FAA-issued pilot credentials were in the center console. No crime, no traffic violation, no reason for police attention, just a pilot driving to work before dawn. But Officer Hutchinson saw her through a lens warped by 19 years of unchecked racial bias. Couldn't accept that an African American woman in this neighborhood, driving this car, wearing that uniform, could be an airline captain. Couldn't imagine that the black woman he was about to pull over had more federal certifications than most professionals, commanded aircraft worth $90 million, and held the lives of 180 passengers in her hands every time she flew. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Richmond, Virginia, the state capital, population 230,000, with a metro area of 1.3 million. A city still wrestling with its Confederate past and its present inequalities. The Museum District, tree-lined streets with historic homes dating to the early 1900s. Median home value, $425,000. The neighborhood was 78% white, the kind of place where seeing a black face at 5 a.m. raised eyebrows, where African Americans were assumed to be domestic workers or didn't belong. Monument Avenue ran through the heart of it, once lined with Confederate statues, now mostly removed, but the neighborhood's demographics hadn't changed much. It was 5:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September. Clear skies, temperature in the low 60s, that crisp early autumn air. The streets were nearly empty, just a few early commuters and the occasional jogger. Captain Simone Ashford had been flying for Delta since she was 24 years old. 14 years of pre-flight checks, takeoffs, landings, turbulence, emergencies handled, passengers delivered safely. She'd flown through storms that made seasoned pilots nervous. She'd landed in crosswinds that exceeded maximum recommendations. She'd handled engine failures, hydraulic issues, medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. She'd graduated from Embry-Riddle magna cum laude, where she'd been one of only 7 black women in her graduating class. She'd completed Air National Guard flight training, where her instructors called her exceptional. Her Czech airmen at Delta called her meticulous. Even pilots who'd been flying longer called her one of the best. She believed in precision. She believed in preparation. She believed that excellence was non-negotiable and that proper procedure could handle any emergency. But she also knew from both professional experience and personal reality that being a black woman in America meant constantly proving you belonged. Racism didn't stop at 4 stripes or federal certifications. White people saw the color before the captain's bars. That Tuesday morning, Simone had woken at 4:30 a.m. Nothing unusual, nothing exciting, just what she did 3 or 4 times a week. She'd gone through her routine: shower, uniform, flight bag check, weather briefing on her phone. She'd kissed her sleeping daughter goodbye, grabbed her travel mug of coffee, and headed to her Audi in the driveway. The car was a 2021 A6, midnight blue, registered in her name, completely paid off. Nice, but not ostentatious. She belonged there. She'd lived in the museum district for 6 years, owned a 3-bedroom house on a tree-lined street, paid property taxes, knew her neighbors. She was doing exactly what thousands of pilots do every single day: driving to the airport for an early departure, reviewing the flight plan in her head, running through pre-flight procedures. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual, nothing that should attract police attention, nothing that would make anyone look twice at a white pilot in uniform doing the exact same thing. But Officer Hutchinson, 9 years on the Richmond PD with 23 complaints documenting his pattern of targeting black citizens in affluent areas, saw something different. Brian Hutchinson had been with Richmond PD since his early 20s, straight out of the police academy in 2005. He'd worked patrol in various districts over the years, but spent the last 8 years on the early morning shift in the museum district and surrounding affluent neighborhoods. His supervisors kept him in this assignment despite his complaint history, because, in their words, he knows the area. Residents feel safe with him. He's proactive. What they meant was that Hutchinson stopped every black person he saw in these neighborhoods, questioned African Americans about their presence, treated black citizens like suspects by default, made white residents feel protected from black people they assumed were criminals or didn't belong. 23 complaints in 19 years, 17 of them involving African American individuals. The pattern was unmistakable. 2012, a black high school teacher walking in Windsor Farms at 6 a.m. Hutchinson stopped her, demanding ID and proof she lived in the area. She was exercising before school, had lived there for 3 years. Hutchinson claimed she matched a vague description of a prowler. Complaint filed, closed with implicit bias training. 2016, an African American software engineer sitting in his parked Tesla in Carytown. Hutchinson detained him for 25 minutes, insisting the vehicle was stolen despite the registration and insurance card. The man owned the car, worked at a tech company downtown, was waiting for his girlfriend. Hutchinson claimed the circumstances were suspicious. Complaint filed, resolved with a written counseling and diversity workshop. 2019, a black cardiologist entering her own medical building at 7 a.m. Hutchinson followed her inside, questioned whether she worked there, demanded to see her medical license. She was starting morning rounds, had been on staff for 8 years. Hutchinson claimed he'd received reports of unauthorized access. Complaint filed, dismissed with cultural awareness workshop requirement. Every complaint told the same story. Hutchinson saw African Americans in white spaces and couldn't accept their legitimacy, couldn't accept that they belonged. He assumed stolen vehicles, assumed trespassing, assumed they were service workers or criminals, assumed they needed to prove their right to exist in these neighborhoods. He demanded proof of belonging, proof of ownership, proof of legitimate presence. Things he never demanded, from white people in the same locations doing the same things. And when complaints were filed, the department responded with training certificates instead of discipline, with workshops instead of consequences, with one more chance instead of termination. Internal Affairs had a file on Hutchinson that should have resulted in termination years ago. 23 documented incidents, 4 settlements paid quietly, 12 credible witnesses, 8 sustained complaints. But Hutchinson had allies in the department, supervisors who valued his arrest numbers and his willingness to work the early shifts that others avoided, union representatives who protected him at every disciplinary hearing, and a system that prioritized officer retention over accountability to the black citizens he repeatedly profiled. That morning at 5:12 a.m., Hutchinson was on patrol on Monument Avenue when he noticed the Audi A6 traveling westbound toward Lombardy Street. He ran the plate automatically, a habit. Virginia registration. Current. Registered to Simone M. Ashford at an address 4 blocks away. But Hutchinson's mind made the calculation it always made. Black woman, nice car, early morning, affluent neighborhood equals suspicious. He didn't consider that this could be someone heading to work, a resident going about her business, a professional with every right to be there. He didn't notice the airline uniform visible through the rear window, the flight bag on the passenger seat, the airport parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror. He saw what his biases trained him to see: a black person who needed investigating, a situation that required his attention, potential criminal activity. He pulled in behind the Audi and activated his lights. Simone saw the blue lights in her rearview mirror, and her stomach dropped. She'd lived this before. Not personally stopped, but she'd heard the stories from other black pilots, from friends, from family. She'd studied the statistics in her required crew resource management training about implicit bias and decision-making under stress. Here we go, she thought. Another morning, another cop who can't believe I belong. She pulled over carefully on Monument Avenue, put the car in park, turned on her interior light, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly as she'd been taught, exactly as her father had taught her when she was 16. Hutchinson approached the driver's side, his hand resting on his service weapon. "License and registration," he said, not asking, demanding. Simone turned slowly, her hand still visible. "Officer, is there a problem? I'm Captain Ashford with Delta Airlines. I'm heading to the airport for a flight departure." "I didn't ask your name," Hutchinson said, his voice sharp. "License and registration. Now." Simone reached slowly for the center console, narrating every movement. "I'm reaching for my pilot credentials and my driver's license. They're right here in the console." She pulled out her FAA-issued airline transport pilot certificate, her Delta ID badge with her photo and captain designation clearly visible, her Virginia driver's license, and the vehicle registration. She handed them to Hutchinson through the window. He examined them with obvious skepticism, his flashlight moving between the documents and her face. "This your car?" he asked. "Yes, officer. It's registered in my name, as you can see on the registration." "What are you doing out here this early?" "I'm driving to Richmond International for my 7:30 departure to Atlanta. I'm a commercial airline captain. I fly for Delta." "Do you think departments should track officers with multiple racial profiling complaints and implement automatic termination after 3 strikes? Drop your answer below." "You got proof you work for Delta?" Hutchinson asked, still holding her credentials. Simone's jaw tightened slightly. "Officer, you're holding my FA pilot certificate and my Delta ID badge. Those are federal credentials. They require extensive background checks, medical certification, and flight testing. They're not something you can fake." "Anybody can buy a uniform," Hutchinson said. "I've had reports of suspicious vehicles in this neighborhood. This isn't a suspicious vehicle. This is my car, registered to my home address 4 blocks from here. I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years, and I'm not suspicious. I'm a pilot in uniform, heading to work." "Step out of the vehicle," Hutchinson ordered. "On what grounds?" Simone asked, her voice controlled but firm. "Officer, I haven't committed any traffic violation. You have my license, registration, and federal pilot credentials. What's your reasonable suspicion for this stop?" "I said step out of the vehicle. Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll charge you with obstruction." Simone paused, calculating. She knew the law, had studied Fourth Amendment cases, knew about Terry stops, and reasonable suspicion requirements. She also knew that arguing with an armed officer at 5:20 a.m. might escalate dangerously. She opened the door slowly and stepped out, her hands visible. Hutchinson positioned her against the side of her car. "You got anything illegal in this vehicle?" "No, sir." "You mind if I search it?" "Yes, I do mind. You have no probable cause, and I don't consent to a search." "If you've got nothing to hide." "Officer Hutchinson," Simone said, reading his nameplate. "I'm an airline captain with the federal government's highest pilot certification. I passed more background checks than most people will ever face. The TSA vets me every time I go through airport security. I have a top-secret clearance from my guard service, and you're treating me like a criminal for driving to work in my own neighborhood while black." "Watch your tone," Hutchinson said. "My tone is professional, just like my credentials, which you're apparently choosing not to believe because I'm an African-American woman and you can't imagine I could possibly be who I say I am." A car pulled over behind Hutchinson's patrol vehicle. Sergeant Linda Morrison, a 16-year veteran who'd worked with Hutchinson before and knew his complaint history well. She stepped out and immediately assessed the situation. A woman in an airline captain's uniform, standing beside a late-model Audi, hands visible, clearly cooperating but visibly frustrated. Hutchinson with his hand still near his weapon, the woman's credentials in his other hand. "Hutchinson, what's the situation?" Morrison asked. "Suspicious vehicle stop, Sarge. Subject claims to be an airline pilot, but..." "Claims to be," Simone interrupted. "You're holding my FAA certificate and my Delta ID." Morrison walked over and took the credentials from Hutchinson. She examined the airline transport pilot certificate carefully, the gold seal, the FAA signature, the ratings and restrictions, the recent medical examination date. She looked at the Delta ID badge, then at Simone's uniform. She pulled out her phone and called Delta's 24-hour crew scheduling line, a number she knew from a previous incident at the airport. "This is Sergeant Morrison, Richmond PD. I need to verify employment for Captain Simone Ashford. Employee ID number." She read from the badge. "Yes, that's correct. And she's scheduled for a flight this morning. Atlanta departure at 7:30. Confirmed. Thank you." Morrison ended the call and turned to Hutchinson with an expression of barely controlled frustration. "Hutchinson, this is Captain Ashford. She's a commercial airline pilot with Delta, verified by crew scheduling. She's scheduled for a departure in just over 2 hours. Her credentials are legitimate and current. What was your reasonable suspicion for this stop?" "Suspicious vehicle in an affluent area, Sarge. Early morning hours. Her vehicle is registered to an address 4 blocks from here." Morrison cut him off. "She's in full uniform heading to the airport for work. What traffic violation did you observe? What crime did you witness? What specific, articulable facts gave you reasonable suspicion to stop her?" Hutchinson hesitated. The neighborhood has had some vehicle thefts. Is this vehicle reported stolen?" "No, but is there any indication of criminal activity whatsoever?" "She was driving in the area. She lives in the area, Hutchinson. She works at the airport. She's doing exactly what any pilot would do at 5:15 in the morning, driving to work." A white man in his 60s, walking his dog, approached. "Officers, I live on this street. I've seen Captain Ashford countless times heading to work in the early morning. She lives right down the block. This is ridiculous." Another witness, a Hispanic woman in scrubs, stopped her car. "I'm an air nurse at VCU Medical. I recognize Captain Ashford. She came to career day at my daughter's school last year to talk about aviation. She's obviously a pilot. What is this about?" Morrison looked at the gathering witnesses, then back at Hutchinson. "Give Captain Ashford her credentials back. Now." Within 7 minutes, Lieutenant Marcus Webb arrived, a 22-year veteran who'd been trying to discipline Hutchinson for years and had been blocked by Union protection and command staff reluctance. He stepped out of his vehicle and immediately saw the problem. A professional, clearly harassed. Multiple witnesses, body cameras running. Everything documented. "Morrison, report," Webb said. "Lieutenant, Captain Ashford is a Delta airline pilot heading to work. Officer Hutchinson stopped her without reasonable suspicion, detained her, questioned her credentials, and requested to search her vehicle without probable cause. Captain Ashford has been completely cooperative and professional throughout." Webb examined Simone's credentials that Morrison handed him. He looked at the 4 stripes on her uniform jacket, the wings pin above her name tag, the professional bearing despite obvious frustration. "Captain Ashford, I'm Lieutenant Webb. On behalf of Richmond PD, I apologize. This stop was completely inappropriate and lacked any legal basis." He turned to Hutchinson, his expression hardening. "Badge and weapon. Now." Hutchinson's face went pale. "Lieutenant, I was just..." 23 complaints, Hutchinson. 17 involving African American citizens. I've been reviewing your file for 3 years. I've recommended termination twice, and you just racially profiled a federal pilot in front of witnesses and cameras. Sir, I had reports of suspicious activity. You had nothing." Webb cut him off. "No traffic violation, no crime observed, no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause. Just a black woman in an affluent neighborhood, and you couldn't accept she belonged there. You saw an airline captain, an assumed criminal. You saw federal credentials and called them suspicious. You treated one of fewer than 150 black female airline captains in this country like she stole the uniform and the car and somehow faked an FAA certificate." Webb stepped closer. "Badge. Weapon. You're on administrative leave effective immediately. And let's be clear, your career is over." Hutchinson handed them over, his hands shaking. Webb turned back to Simone. "Captain Ashford, this was racial profiling. It was unlawful detention. It violated your Fourth Amendment rights. If you choose to file a complaint or pursue legal action, and you absolutely should, the department will cooperate fully. This pattern should have ended years ago." Simone looked at Hutchinson, then at Webb, taking a moment to gather herself. "Lieutenant, I've been flying commercial aircraft for 14 years. I've completed training on crew resource management, decision-making under pressure, emergency procedures. I know what bias looks like. I've studied human factors and how assumptions lead to errors." She gestured toward Hutchinson. "Your officer just committed textbook racial profiling. He stopped me because I'm black, in a nice car, in a white neighborhood at an hour when he assumed I couldn't possibly belong. He saw my uniform and didn't believe it. He saw my federal pilot credentials and suggested they were fake. He demanded a search despite having zero probable cause." She pointed to the witnesses. "Everything is documented. The lack of reasonable suspicion, the racial profiling. All of it. Lieutenant, I command aircraft worth $90 million. I'm responsible for the lives of up to 180 passengers every time I fly. I have more federal certifications than most attorneys. I passed background checks that took months. And your officer treated me like a car thief for driving to work." She paused. "So yes, I'll be filing a complaint. And yes, I'll be pursuing legal action, not for money, but because if this happens to me, a captain with federal credentials, professional standing, resources, imagine what happens to young black women who don't have my platform, my knowledge, my ability to fight back." How many others has Officer Hutchinson stopped who couldn't challenge him? How many black citizens did he profile who didn't have witnesses or cameras? How many complaints would it have taken before someone acted? By that afternoon, the story was spreading through Richmond's African American community, Delta's pilot corps, and onto local news. Video clips from witness phones and Morrison's body camera went viral. #flying. While black started trending. #Captain Ashford. #Justice for Simone. Headlines: Delta captain racially profiled by Richmond officer on way to work. Airline pilot with federal credentials detained without cause. Officer with 17 similar complaints caught on camera profiling black pilot. The Airline Pilots Union issued a statement. Captain Ashford is an exemplary pilot and professional. This incident represents exactly the kind of racial profiling that our industry and our nation must eliminate. We stand with Captain Ashford and demand accountability. Delta Airlines released a statement. We are deeply disturbed by the treatment of Captain Ashford. She is a highly respected member of our flight operations team, and this incident of racial profiling is completely unacceptable. The National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives condemned the stop, calling it an obvious case of profiling that never should have occurred. Richmond's NAACP chapter demanded Hutchinson's immediate termination and systematic review of all stops by officers with multiple similar complaints. Simone hired Benjamin Torres, a prominent civil rights attorney who'd won several high-profile racial profiling cases. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later, naming Officer Brian Hutchinson Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, who'd kept Hutchinson in affluent neighborhoods despite his complaint history, Captain Derek Walsh, who'd blocked previous termination attempts, and Richmond Police Department. The allegations were comprehensive. Racial profiling in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion or probable cause in violation of the 4th Amendment. Denial of civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Secretary 1983. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. False imprisonment. Supervisory liability for failure to train, discipline, or terminate despite documented pattern. Municipal liability for deliberate indifference to Hutchinson's pattern of racial profiling. Violation of Virginia civil rights statutes. The complaint included Hutchinson's entire history. 23 complaints over 19 years. 17 involving African Americans in similar circumstances. Affluent areas. Professional settings. White neighborhoods. All documented. All investigated. All resulting in minimal discipline. All dismissed with training that never changed his behavior. The lawsuit laid out the pattern systematically. Complaint after complaint, year after year, black victim after black victim, similar circumstances, similar assumptions, similar harassment, $2.1 million in damages, plus attorney fees and mandatory policy reforms. Richmond city attorneys reviewed the case. The file was damning. Security footage from a nearby business showed everything. Simone driving normally, no traffic violations, the stop without cause, her cooperation, the escalation. Morrison's body camera captured the lack of reasonable suspicion, Hutchinson's inability to articulate a crime, the obvious credential verification, his refusal to accept legitimacy. Multiple independent witnesses corroborated the account. Simone's credentials, ID, vehicle registration, and flight schedule proved her complete legitimacy. Hutchinson had no legal basis for the stop. No crime, no reasonable suspicion, no articulable facts. Internal affairs files documented the pattern. 23 complaints, 17 involving black citizens, all ignored. Every element of a Power 1983 claim was present. 4th Amendment violation, check. 14th Amendment violation, check. Municipal liability for deliberate indifference, check. Qualified immunity, unlikely to apply given clear precedent against racial profiling. The city's risk assessment was clear. Go to trial and lose publicly, with a jury verdict potentially 3 times higher. Settle now and implement reforms. The city settled 11 months later. $1.8 million paid to Captain Simone Ashford, the second largest settlement in Richmond history for racial profiling. Officer Brian Hutchinson was terminated 4 weeks after the incident. The union filed grievances, demanded arbitration, but withdrew after reviewing the body camera footage and the pattern documentation. The termination letter was comprehensive. Officer Hutchinson engaged in racial profiling, detaining a citizen based solely on race without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. He violated department policy on constitutional policing, bias-free policing, and proper detention procedures. He has demonstrated a pattern over 19 years of similar conduct, indicating this was not an isolated incident, but a persistent failure. His continued employment creates unacceptable liability for the city and violates the civil rights of citizens, particularly African American residents. The letter specifically cited 17 prior complaints showing the same racial profiling pattern, noting that progressive discipline had failed to modify behavior. Employment terminated immediately. Hutchinson's name was entered into the National Decertification Index, preventing him from ever working in law enforcement again anywhere in the country. His 19-year law enforcement career ended permanently. No pension enhancements, no retirement in good standing, no law enforcement work anywhere. Captain Simone Ashford testified before Richmond City Council at a packed hearing 3 months after the incident. Dozens of supporters filled the room, fellow pilots, members of Sisters of the Skies, local clergy, civil rights activists, community members. The media documented every word. I'm an airline captain. I've dedicated 14 years to safely transporting passengers, business travelers, families, people trusting me with their lives. I've lived in Richmond for 6 years, paid taxes, volunteered at schools to inspire young people to consider aviation careers. I know my rights. I know the Constitution, because I've sworn to support and defend it as a Guard member. I know what unlawful stops look like because I've received training on crew resource management and bias recognition. And Officer Hutchinson stopped me for driving while black, for existing in a white neighborhood while black, for having the audacity to be an African-American woman in an airline captain's uniform that he couldn't believe was real. She paused, her voice controlled but firm. I was humiliated in my own neighborhood, treated like a criminal in front of witnesses for driving to work, detained for doing exactly what thousands of white pilots do every day without question. 23 complaints over 19 years, 17 involving African Americans. That's not bad luck. That's not mistakes. That's not a few bad apples. That's a pattern. That's policy. That's the department tolerating racism. A pattern your department tolerated for nearly 2 decades because Officer Hutchinson's supervisors valued his arrest numbers and his willingness to profile black citizens over our constitutional rights. She looked at each council member. $1.8 million is what it cost to finally remove one officer who should have been fired after complaint 3. But money doesn't undo standing beside my car at 5:20 in the morning, being treated like I stole my uniform. It doesn't erase explaining to my 11-year-old daughter why a police officer didn't believe her mother is a pilot. And it doesn't prevent the next officer with 23 complaints from doing the same thing to the next victim who can't fight back. This council needs to ask itself, why did it take 23 complaints? Why did it take a lawsuit? Why did it take someone with my resources and credentials to finally get action? And what happened to all the victims before me who couldn't fight back? Standing ovation from supporters. Several council members visibly uncomfortable. Richmond PD announced policy reforms 7 months later. The chief acknowledged the need for change, admitted the system had failed, committed to preventing future incidents. Measures included automatic supervisory review after 2 complaints with similar patterns within 24 months. Mandatory termination proceedings after 3 sustained complaints involving racial profiling. Real-time flagging system for officers with patterns of stops involving racial disparities. Mandatory supervisor approval for any stop in affluent neighborhoods involving only suspicious person calls without specific criminal activity. Body camera footage review of 100% of stops involving minority citizens in predominantly white areas. Anti-racism training conducted by actual civil rights experts and victims of profiling, not police trainers. Command staff accountability. Supervisors who ignore patterns face discipline up to termination. Community Oversight Board with subpoena power to review complaint patterns. Quarterly public reporting of stops by officer, race, location, and outcome. Integration of National Decertification Index. Checks to prevent hiring officers terminated for racial profiling elsewhere. The police union initially opposed several reforms, particularly command staff accountability and the 3-complaint rule, but relented under public pressure. Why do departments wait for the 23rd complaint instead of acting on the 3rd? Why does it take a lawsuit to implement common sense accountability? Comment your thoughts. Reforms to be fully implemented within 9 months, with progress reports every quarter. This wasn't about one Tuesday morning stop. This wasn't about one confrontation. This was about a department that let Brian Hutchinson profile black citizens for 19 years despite 23 documented complaints showing a clear pattern of racial profiling. The pattern was obvious from complaint 3. A black accountant questioned in Windsor Farms. An African-American business owner asked for proof in her own parking lot. It was undeniable by complaint 10. Same story, different victim, same bias, different day, same assumptions, different location. But Richmond PD kept Hutchinson on patrol, kept assigning him to affluent neighborhoods, kept ignoring the warnings, kept accepting the excuses until he finally profiled someone with the knowledge, resources, and courage to force accountability. Simone paid the price, treated like a criminal outside her own neighborhood, detained for driving to work, humiliated for wearing a uniform and credentials she'd spent 40 years earning. The message delivered clearly: your 4 stripes don't matter. Your federal certifications don't matter. Your professional accomplishments don't matter as much as your race. Brian Hutchinson's career is over. Terminated. Decertified. Barred from law enforcement permanently. That's consequence. The city paid $1.8 million. That's accountability. The department implemented reforms. That's progress. But those measures came after 19 years and 23 complaints. 19 years of black victims who didn't have Simone's advantages. Federal pilot credentials, institutional support, resources to fight back. 19 years of African American residents who were profiled, harassed, detained, and had no recourse. No witnesses, no cameras, no resources, no platform, no one listening. How many others did Hutchinson stop in those 19 years? How many young black men detained without cause? How many African American women questioned about belonging? How many professionals humiliated who couldn't fight back? How many complaints never filed because victims knew nothing would change? The real question isn't why Hutchinson did this. Racists will racist. The question is why the system let him keep doing it. Why do departments wait for complaint 23 instead of acting on complaint 3? Why do they recognize patterns after 17 similar incidents instead of stopping them after 5? Why do they prioritize protecting officers with documented racist patterns over protecting the black citizens those officers target? Why does it take an airline captain, someone with federal credentials white people respect, to finally get accountability? Why do settlements come from taxpayer money while officers who caused them face no financial consequences? Because if we don't fix the system that kept Brian Hutchinson patrolling white neighborhoods for 19 years, if we don't address the culture that protected him despite the pattern, valued his arrest stats over civil rights, ignored black victims until a credentialed one fought back, then we're just waiting for the next officer with 23 complaints. The next black professional, the next African American human being who gets profiled for existing while black, for having the audacity to belong, for the crime of being in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin color. This case represents thousands of others that never make news. Tens of thousands of black Americans profiled every year by officers who never face consequences. Millions of stops based on race, not crime. A system where being black is treated as reasonable suspicion. Comment if this should be federal law. Any officer with 3 similar complaints within 3 years faces automatic termination. No implicit bias training that doesn't work. No diversity workshops that change nothing. No progressive discipline that protects racism. Immediate termination. Career over. Out of law enforcement permanently. 3 complaints. 3 similar incidents. 3 African Americans profiled in similar circumstances. That's not isolated incidents. That's a pattern. And patterns should end careers, not black lives' comfort and dignity. And if you believe these stories matter, if you think 19 years of complaints should result in accountability before year 20, if you believe black professionals deserve the same presumption of belonging that white people get automatically, then hit that subscribe button. We're exposing racial profiling. We're demanding real accountability. We're fighting for every black American who's been profiled. This isn't about one officer or one airline captain. It's about a system that gave Hutchinson 23 chances, 23 complaints, 17 black victims, 19 years, while black Americans don't even get the benefit of the doubt. It's about departments that protect officers with documented patterns of racial profiling and the African American human beings who pay the price for that protection with their dignity, their safety, and their constitutional rights.